any of the clips we've just seen, would you care to share a time when you've watched a movie or television show that depicts a relationship that makes you think, this is so wrong? What was it that struck you about it? Oh, I think you're muted, Brett.
It's off the rom-com map a little bit, but it was a romance. And this might be a little provocative, but it was Call Me By Your Name. I was really struck by the kind of predatory nature of that relationship. The Armie Hammer character was supposed to be 28 and the boy was supposed to be 17, but he was a much more mature man. The boy, Timothy Chalamet, is a slight, sort of pre-adult body male. And so that relationship, and then the kind of the parents watching it with, kind of an amusement at the lark of their boy. And I thought at the time, if this had been a underage girl, people would have been really infuriated. And I think because it was a kind of sensitive and kind of warm look at a queer boy's coming of age story, right, that people were more accepting of it. But I think I was struck at the time by the absence of that critique around it. I think that critique has emerged now, right? I think that's part of the discourse around it. But anyway, that.
Thank you, Brett. Manhattan comes to mind with a 48-year-old dating a 17-year-old high school senior. At the time, maybe none of us thought about how unsavory this was, but now looking back through today's lens, much more significantly. What about you, Geraldine? Oh, I don't see Geraldine.
Remembered all by myself to unmute. So I don't do rom-coms, as I realized that was a genre I know nothing about. But I watched a serial, it's an English serial called The Split. It's about divorce lawyers and three sisters and their mother, and they became divorce lawyers. So it's kind of an interesting story in that they moved into family law when no men were moving into it. But what was portrayed in the episode that really struck with me was the way in which a woman started to think about her relationship as being one in which she had no ability to make choices. So something worried her about it. Her husband was focused on her appearance, wanted her to dress in a particular way, made remarks about her body, and whenever she spoke in ways that he felt were problematic, it was sort of very well portrayed that he would do something to her, like hurt her, squeeze her finger or pull. So it was sort of minor level abuse, but he was a very famous recording artist or producer. A lot of people depended on him for their employment. And it turned out that she wasn't the only person that he was engaging in this kind of coercive behavior with. There were a lot of other people. And in the end, it was one other person. It was his personal assistant who said, for years, I have covered up. I have, because if I speak out, my job in the industry, my chances will be gone. And so, what you see is the way in which a group of women came together to help her get out of that relationship. But that sort of coercion, which can be in the guise of somebody being loving towards you or sort of helping you out, can be misinterpreted when what you think it matters about you is being well perceived by this person. And so I think that this is something that's come out with the Me Too movement quite a lot, that it's not just one person who's been coerced or abused, it's a lot of people. So Marjy, you have to unmute.
All of us. It sounds like in that show, there might have been, in the end, a more honest portrayal of what was wrong with that relationship. And we see in so many rom-coms that it's just portrayed as fun, and there's no closure where somebody says, you know what, that wasn't okay. What about you, Charlene?
So for me, it would have to be Bridgerton.
Yeah.
And, I must say that I have watched the show and, elements of the show that I enjoyed, but I would definitely say that there were multiple things in the show that I think can be very harmful. Like, for example, the color blindness aspect of the show, which, I know many people would view it in a more positive light, but I think when we're talking about it in the context of today's discussion, the piece that really stood up for me was when Daphne, and I don't know like her real name in real life, I just know the character. When Daphne held Simon down whilst they were like forcing him to have sex, especially with the history behind that Simon didn't want to bear children. I found that very problematic. I think that I've spoken to people who look at it from the angle of, girl boss. People have said perhaps that was Daphne's journey. For me, in that lens, I didn't find it romantic. I didn't think it was a girl boss like move. It actually did feel more of a spousal marital rape to me. And I always, when I have these discussions with friends, I always, reflect back to if the roles had been reversed, like we would be seeing this all over social media about how, if the roles had been reversed, this would have been glamorizing a rape culture. And then if the roles had been reversed, not only in gender, but even in race-wise, it would have a very different depiction. So that's one piece that really stood out for me with the Bridgerton show.
Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion on social media about that particular episode. And, we could have a long conversation about whether or not there was consent there. And people also, are not used to thinking about the woman in the role as the perpetrator. And, but that was really interesting for me to read after it became such a hit, that people were saying, wait a minute, so thank you for that. Thank you all. Does anyone on our panel feel that the depictions of relationships have changed or improved over time? Some of the clips that we saw are from several years ago. Bridgerton is very recent. Are there things that still make you, roll your eyes and sort of cringe, or do you think we've made some progress on these issues? Brett?
Excuse me. So I'll sort of come at this from a couple directions. One is I think that viewers are more sophisticated than we probably give them credit for. And I sort of base my data there on the teaching NYU students for the last 20 years, and primarily young NYU women. And they are super savvy, attuned to all kinds of things. So I think so I'll say that. And I think that, kind of rom-coms, right? And romances and generally are still, they're formulaic in a lot of ways. And I think that there's still some kind of pressure on women to sort of change themselves for men, to be a little bit more in that kind of courtship moment, perhaps more helpless. But I also think that there's a kind of shift that the expectation is that the sort of lead female is quite capable, right? She's smart, she is accomplished, and she's not gonna give herself up for and sort of change her life for somebody who is scary, threatening, and will demean her or diminish her in some way, right? So I think in a lot of ways, what's changed is the guys are the ones who have to grow up, right? They have to sort of grow out of their boyhood and into manhood before these quite competent young women will sort of agree that they're going to be partners. And I think part of that is that the guys have to accept the women on equal terms, or even that, like, wow, she's sort of better and smarter and more capable than I am, and I will make the sacrifices. And I think that's an important shift. So I'll say, yeah, I think that, you know, sort of based on audience, who's in the writing room, right, who's on the stage,
Right.
that there are more positive, powerfully depicted young women who are the kind of the leads in the rom-coms. So
Great. Any of our other panelists want to add to that? Brett, just following up on that, some media platforms have sort of included disclaimers or simply pulled this problematic content off their sites or networks. What are your thoughts, and other panelists jump in if you want, on this approach when it comes to depicting unhealthy relationships and bad behavior, particularly when, you know, throughout the past couple of years, particularly with Me Too, it is very clear that at least in some facets of society, attitudes have really changed. You know, for example, My Fair Lady is being re-examined. What do you think of that approach as a professor of media, of just pulling stuff and you know, without discussion or throwing a disclaimer up on the screen?
that's a great question. As somebody who's a historian by training and disposition, I sort of think these things ought to be discussed. So if, you know, it's My Fair Lady's sort of depiction of Eliza, and the kind of treatment of Eliza as low, right, sort of inadequate. I think it's really interesting to think about why that is so distasteful now, right? How it's out of sync with contemporary standards and norms, and why it might have been acceptable, right? And so I think that sort of any opportunity to have a conversation about history and change, like, why have things changed? Why have they remained the same? I think is a really interesting kind of historical question to ask about any of these objects. So I think disclaimers and conversations, right? Sort of a forum for a conversation around it is really rich. And in the same way that I think, you know, rather than removing Confederate monuments, I think contextualize them, historicize them. There's remarkable tools out there for kind of contemporary display culture and museumology, right? That sort of could make for fantastic educational tools, opportunities for people to think about the past and the present and shifting attitudes over time, and why those artifacts were put up when they were, by whom, right? What was their point? Why were they accepted for so long? Why are they not accepted anymore? So to me, like, the more conversation about troubling issues is better. And I think the assumption of audience competence and audience capacity to embrace complexity, understand complicated things, and to learn from these conversations.
Charlene?
Yes, I was gonna say, I'm so glad you said that, Brett, because I agree. You know, I feel that just pulling them out leaves that gap for meaningful and rich conversations. So I am completely with Brett with this aspect of any opportunity that we have to engage in a conversation, I think is needed and is helpful. So I think that when we start to look, like, for example, you know, the movie, The Notebook, and Marjy, I know you've sat in some of my trainings,
Yeah.
talking I use the notebook a lot in my workshops and trainings to look at how elements of that behavior, which, you know, in the notebook can come across as romantic, can actually be viewed from a place of concerning behaviors that sometimes depict stalking behavior. So I'm with Brett on this one, that I think that instead of, you know, some of these things being pulled off, perhaps using that as a forum to have rich conversations about why was it okay then? Why is it distasteful now? I think there's an educational component in that. So that's my take on that question.
Okay, great. Geraldine, do you want to add anything to that? What do you think? Do you think these
So
things should just be pulled, or do you think, you know, we have to do more?
I think that we have to do more than just pull things, but we also have to think about how we might do them differently today. So
Right.
the question that I had for Charlene was how might Bridgerton have been different? How might that scene have been dealt with differently? Because what really had struck me with Bridgerton was the reason that Simone didn't want to have children, which went back to his own the terrible way that he was treated by his father. But it also, he was making the decision kind of unilaterally that he didn't want to have children. And so how could both of them have gotten figured out a different way to solve this problem? And so that's kind of one thing. And I hope we get back to this question, because what I've seen over the past, since last year when George Floyd was murdered so tragically in Minneapolis, is some of the police shows and SVU, which, you know, is everybody's favorite, look at issues that involve racism in encounters between the police and the communities that they serve being portrayed very differently. So there was one episode in which there was a sort of a Karen-like incident in Central Park, and the SVU star, she went back and reinterpreted her behavior. She said, I didn't look beyond who might be the perpetrator. That was obvious, and she was wrong. But so I think that that's sort of a way that media can think about doing things differently. We can only think about doing things differently if we can see problems in what's been done in the past. So Charlene, how could you, I'm not taking over here, but I really would be interested in hearing how you think Bridgerton could have been done differently around that theme.
I don't know if I have the ultimate ideal response to that, but I definitely will say that, you know, you raised the point around the two of them having a conversation so that there is some level of consent going on. It did feel to me as though, you know, I don't quite think Simone made it very clear to Daphne the reasons behind why he didn't want to have a child. And I think, again, when we start to talk about consent and we start to talk about relationships, communication is very key in that, right? So I think, and again, it seems very minute, very minor, but I think communication was lacking in that. So I don't know if I have the absolute response to that question for you, but I think something that could have been done differently was perhaps some level of communication to some degree where both people in the relationship could reach some level of understanding. I don't know. And again, you know, Geraldine, I think I'm also looking at Bridgerton from the lens of being a Black woman. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of it more from the aspect of, you know, we have a white female character that is like, you know, sitting on top of a Black male character. And so I think even when we look at it in that aspect, that just feels completely very problematic. But the response to your question, I would say, would have been the conversation, right? I mean, if I can be very personal, like I recently got married and my partner and I are both on different stages in our life in terms of children, right? One person wants, the other person isn't ready. And we are mutually having those conversations and figuring what would work versus one person jumping on top of another. So I think that is maybe what I would have liked to see happen differently in that sense. And again, I don't know if that's the ultimate ideal response, but I think there was a way that could have played out a bit differently, especially when we factor in the racial component too, because this would have been a whole different conversation again if the roles had been reversed.
That's great, Charlene. I appreciate that. And I think that, we can take a long look back and think that, there were some classics like Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, that would have been, have aspects, they were wonderful movies, but have aspects that now when we look back through our lens, had really problematic behaviors. And so I think that the key that we probably all agree on is that, conversations about these classics are important instead of maybe just getting rid of them. So I'm going to ask you one more question right now, which is, and anyone can raise their hand. What do you think is the impact of, let's just say, a college community, students, faculty, in seeing these types of depictions? Does it translate to actual instances of misconduct or a shift in behavior and attitudes? Do we really think that we watch and then we do? Or do we have brain functions that filter the behavior and we really decide, do we want to engage in this behavior? Are they right? Is it, I see it, and then I'm going to do it because after all, my favorite star just did it. What do you think about that? What's the real impact? And any one of you can jump in.
I think impact, go ahead, Charlene, you were going to say something.
I was going to say, I don't know if it changes behavior. I don't feel like I'm an expert in that, but I think speaking from my experience doing educational workshops with like a college campus community, I think what I worry about is I think sometimes it normalizes certain behaviors that really shouldn't be normalized. I also think that it gives this depiction of that like relationships are easy and bubbly and romantic. And I'm going to use again The Notebook just because I grew up watching The Notebook, and once upon a time I loved The Notebook till I went to school. And then I started to see some problems in it, right? So oftentimes in my role as a violence educator that works with higher eds across New York, there is this sense of like the persistent love being romantic, the like chasing, the following as being romantic. And the question often I pose to students when I'm doing this is it really romantic if it's not consensual? If I don't want to be followed, if I don't want someone who has been calling me, showing up at fairs and shows, showing up, standing on a I don't know what those things are called.
Ferris wheel?
Yes, threatening to jump off. Is it really romantic? And how does that then force, in this case, the lady who then had to forcibly say, okay, I will go out with you on a date. So there's that sense of like certain behaviors are normalized, and it becomes very important then when we are talking about the ways in which media depicts them. So that's what I wanted to share about this. I don't know if it's a complete behavior change, but I think normalization of certain behaviors can be very problematic and can give this illusion of like relationship is easy, it's a bubble, and certain things like persistence in a relationship is romantic when actually it's not. It can actually be very harmful.
Okay, any students, if you have comments or questions, please, or anybody who's here, please put them in the chat. Brett, what do you think about that?
That's a complicated one, right? Because I think that it's like demonstrating the effect of any given artifact is kind of a fool's errand in the world of media, partly because we're surrounded by so many things, right? We absorb so many things. In the censorship battles that I looked at in my book, like it was how can you sort of bring this troubled text, right, before the courts and say that there's any evidence of harm from this one text when people are looking at advertisements, right? They're reading the newspapers, they're listening to the radio, they are watching television, they're seeing films, right? So there's a kind of cultural surround that makes it very hard to say that any particular text has a demonstrable effect. And I think that, you know, items are popular because they reinforce or give a nudge to ideas that are already out there. Right? Maybe they shine a light on them in new ways or make them, you know, sort of creative and unique. But I think by and large, films and TV shows don't get too far ahead of where audiences are. That said, I think there's this, you know, young women, college educated women, college age women have these tools of analysis, interpretation, and language about what they find creepy, icky, yucky, scary, gross, right? That I think that they're empowered to use in a way that even a half a generation ago they weren't, right? And so I think that there's a kind of a capacity to push back against these images. Like, that guy's a stalker, right? That language is out there. So, you know, and I think that kind of the films that have had big effects are kind of outliers, right? Like Birth of a Nation, right, gave rise to, you know, massive enrollment in the KKK, right? And took the NAACP sort of 30 years of battling that before communities would quit showing it, right? But it played into sort of white supremacist stuff. And you know, Natural Born Killers and A Clockwork Orange had copycat crimes attached to them, but again, those are kind of outliers. So I think it's hard to say what are the kind of demonstrable effects, because these things sit within a culture where these values are out there. And I think, you know, the Me Too movement really indicates how contested the kind of masculine prerogatives are. And now more routinely punished, right, as they ought to be. So I sort of go back to my prior position about, like, I sort of trust the competence of the viewer and the tools. So.
And what, Geraldine, you have anything to add about this?
So what I would say is that I think media has a much bigger influence on people's perceptions, and especially stereotypes and of stigmatized groups, of groups that they're not part of. Yeah. So again, this shows what I watch, but what really disturbs me is the way in which people who are incarcerated are portrayed as being sort of worthy of being raped. So you are seeing on the crime shows somebody being told that if they go to Rikers or to Sing Sing, the two prisons that I work in, that this will happen to you. And I feel that allows for an acceptance of that kind of behavior, but much more so in relation to groups we don't know or institutions we're not part of or haven't visited than institutions that we are. So it's the sort of way in which it makes differences between and the places that we don't go to much more dangerous. And that I think is something that the media has a responsibility for doing differently.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Go ahead, Brett.
I just said that's a great point.
Yeah. So while we've been talking about mainstream movies and media pornography is also widely used. There's been, many studies of, the use of pornography by students, or people ages 18 to 24. And there's a range of pornography that's available. And sometimes, particularly on the porn that you're not paying for, there's an emphasis on treating women as objects in degrading ways. Do you think that this contributes to attitudes and behavioral norms in relationships? Do we see, and Brett, you're studying this and you're writing a book about it, do we see that this contributes to behavioral norms in relationships? Copycats, I see it and I do it. I see it in porn, well then I'm gonna do it. Leading to a link between violence against women and what someone has seen in pornography, given the huge percentage of college students that are watching it on a regular basis when they haven't really had a whole lot of sex education, K through 12.
Yeah, I think sort of porn as the site of sex education is one of the great, failures in this country. We have, I believe, 26 states are not required to have scientifically or medically accurate sex education in their public schools. I actually don't study porn or write about it. But in my class on censorship in American culture, we always have a section on it. We had that section yesterday, and it was it's always illuminating. And I try to just listen, and I think that students, they're sort of aware of that variety, right? On the one hand, that kind of free Pornhub stuff, they recognize it's violent. It's often really racist. Like the highest ranked, the most searched things are about dominating Japanese women, right? Dominating Asian women, and then like humiliating African-American women, and there's pain and humiliation. And I think this, they look at that and like that so doesn't speak to me. I am not interested in, and that is there an effect of that? I think that the young women who speak up about this say there is an effect of this, and that I am expected to do stuff in my dating life, right, in my relationships that I don't want to do and I'm not comfortable with, and I get pressure to not be so vanilla, right? And for years now, this is somebody always says this, and then other people's heads nod. At the same time, right, I think that they recognize that, and it's often behind the paywall, there is this other world of kind of much more humane stuff that's, porn made by women for couples, porn made by women for women, queer stuff that's not like violent or dominating, and it doesn't like feature the young sort of prepubescent boy. And so there's a lot more sort of attention to consent and pleasure, mutual pleasure and listening. And that, I think that world is I think the students say that that's interesting, right? I can learn things there. I can learn things about my own desire. I can learn things about my partner's desire. I can learn things about that incredibly complicated world of sexual desire out there. And I think they draw a distinction between those sort of behind the paywall and the free stuff. They also understand the really exploitative financial arrangements of the free stuff. $60 billion industry worldwide annually, and those people who sort of download their stuff from their cell phones, they don't make a cent. Right.
That's right. There was a magazine article in the New York Times about a year or two ago with a group of high school students that were learning porn literacy. Yeah. And they the kids all thought it was just great. And then the teachers told them how much the actors actually make, and which is pitifully small, and you know, what's really happening there. And interviewed some of those people, and the students were, you know, upset and concerned about that, and didn't find it as compelling as they did at the beginning of the class. So we have one question from a student, or I'm not sure whether you're a student or a community member, but Hedda, would you say the media is a reflection of the culture, or culture is a reflection of the media? Mainly in terms of how people may imitate behavior. In other words, for example, joining the KKK or something like that. Brett, anybody? Geraldine, Charlene? What do you think? You're nodding, Brett. What do you think?
That's a rich, complicated question. You know, I think so in, you know, in that sort of moment of the massive Klan recruitment, using Birth of a Nation, sort of white supremacist values reigned supreme. There were governors and senators and Supreme Court justices, right? A Supreme Court justice who was a member of the Klan. That kind of anti-immigration laws, right, were being passed by Congress. There was a real effort to like whiten American society and getting Jews, right, kind of anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism that was involved in that. Was really about sort of protecting the Puritan white stock. And so it did kind of reflect the culture, and its popularity reflected the culture, and it taught the culture. It certainly taught people who went to the film, like what, you know, how Black people should keep their place, right? Don't be ambitious. Don't think you can be a political leader. That now, right, we understand it as this horribly racist artifact that was really powerful at its time. So I think, you know, what does media reflect now? A lot more people of color behind the camera, in the writers' rooms, on the stages, writing the script. So and you know, there was a kind of, somebody brought up responsibility before. I think that's the kind of media responsibility now. Bring as many people from as many walks of life into those institutions, make them writers, right? Make them actors, make them editors, make them camera people, so that the scene in Bridgerton, right, if there are people of color on that set, say, you know, there's a whole history about racial domination here that maybe we shouldn't replicate, right? And you catch that kind of stuff. So I think what media models reflects the people who are producing it.
Great. Any last minute comments, Charlene, Geraldine, before we close?
So I would say in relation to that was, we don't know which direction it goes in, if it goes in any direction. I mean, we've had this conversation a lot with young people that I spend time with around rap lyrics, and what young people say is that this is our life. We want, and this is expresses what we want to say about it. It's not telling us anything. It's not influencing anything that we don't know. And older people think that it's having a causal effect. So that's kind of an observation as opposed to an answer to the question. But I think that kind of censorship and of what especially young people want to say, and this is kind of different from the media, is probably going to do more harm than allowing for the free expression of what our lives are like.
Great, Charlene.
I think in responding to that, I think it's more complex, and I feel like it really ultimately shouldn't be about censorship. I'm all about forums to be able to discuss this further, and so that's how I would respond, because I kind of feel like I've seen ways in which media is a reflection of culture, and I've seen ways in which culture is a reflection of media. So I think my take on this would be that whenever opportunities present itself, to have forums to bring this to the table for discussions.
Great, thank you. So we're running out of time. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your amazing insights and your time and your expertise with our community. As you know, today's event was hosted by the Office of University Life. Please visit our website to learn more about resources and future events.